just want to thank you all so much for being here. Thank you to Javier and Jimena for being the leaders of this whole Latinx Heritage Month this year. And thank you especially to Dr. Saida Dinzey-Flores for agreeing to come give us this talk. We are very excited for this presentation. And as is customary for our university, I would like to start with a little land acknowledgement and for any event involving the University of Michigan, it is crucial to acknowledge the indigenous land that we stand on in this institution. Although this event is being held virtually, this event is being done through the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. The land that its campus is built on was stolen from the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Powhatan people through the Treaty of Fort Meigs in 1817. It is crucial that we acknowledge the generational pain and trauma that this elitist, capitalist, and racist institution has caused the indigenous people of this land, and it is imperative that we as a community strive to repair that damage. As students, we need to push our administration to make amends through reparations to indigenous people, and as academics, we must strive to decolonize our education and listen to and uplift the voices and work of our indigenous siblings. There's always more work than this to be done, but we begin by honoring the great injustice that this institution was founded on. Okay, and just to give an introduction to Dr. Dinzey-Flores, Professor Saida Dinzey-Flores is a Doctor of Latino and Caribbean Studies and Sociology at Rutgers University. Her research focuses on understanding how urban spaces mediate community life and race, class, and social inequality. She's also the author of Locked In, Locked Out, Gated Communities in a Puerto Rican City, published in 2013, which I will link in the chat box in a few moments in case anybody is interested in purchasing the book, which I definitely am. It sounds really interesting. So without further ado, I would like to get started with this presentation. So thank you so much again, Dr. Dinzey-Flores, and I will leave it to you now.
Hi, thank you for the invitation and the organization, Clara, Javier, Jimena. It is my pleasure to be here. It's great to connect with a place that I hold dear, the University of Michigan, where I spent quite a number of years and where I finished my PhD and remember fondly. So thank you very much for having me and for organizing this. It's been quite, I think, a different kind of Latino Heritage Month, Latinx Heritage Month, and I think focusing for better or for worse on questions of race. I think it's long overdue, and so in some ways I am saddened that it takes kind of like this kind of upheaval to get here, but I'm also comforted by the thought that there is some openness and movement to conversation. So thank you for engaging this question of Black Latinidad, and I'm suggesting one side of this conversation, but there are many on how race matters for Latinos. So I want to start seeing if you recognize or remember this person on the left, Rachel Gentile. And for some of you, you may have been very young and likely don't remember, and others it may seem like yesterday. Rachel Gentile was young Trayvon Martin's friend and the last person he spoke to before he was murdered. Many things were said about Rachel Gentile when she testified in the murder trial of George Zimmerman in 2013. The most notable alluded to her manner of speaking and her questions about her education and literacy. With all the still painful details of that case, of the tragic and unwarranted murder of another young Black man, the Trayvon Martin case was also rife with portrayals of how race operates in the United States. Latinos and their racial repertoire and positionality in particular came into focus as questions were raised about George Zimmerman's non-whiteness, given his Peruvian mother, and juror B29's unpinnable brown racial identity that made her the only minority in the all-women jury. So this is George Zimmerman and juror B29. And I don't wanna put George Zimmerman too long here, so I'm gonna move on. Fewer questioning about racial complexities were raised with regards to racial Gentile. Gentile was quickly boxed as a symbol of an uneducated, marginal, unsightly symbol of Black subculture or counterculture. The fact that she was multilingual, spoke Haitian Creole, Spanish, and English, and was the daughter, and is the daughter of a Haitian immigrant mother and a Dominican immigrant father from Dominican Republic. The fact that she indeed was a Latina went largely overlooked. Instead, Gentile was understood as simply Black, which is taken to mean African American, which in turn is meant to not be Latina. Chantel's racial flattening also occurred to Trayvon, of course, at great cost, the cost of his life. But that Chantel's multilingual and Latino experience were left in the shadows shows us something about her racial experience and the ways in which Latinidad's boundaries are erected and maintained. While Zimmerman's access to Latinidad and whiteness were under negotiation, Chantel's Blackness eliminated the nuances. It caricatured her and devoid her of her Black Latinx Caribbean reality. Indeed, in the context of the racial paradigms of the transnational imperial America, the Americas, much more than the US, but including the US, computations of Latinidad go awry. I love the artist Toño Rosario, and he has this song where he says, ta cruzado, ta cruzado, ta cruzado, and it's like they get crossed at the notion of a Black Latinx person. So Chantel's Blackness really contrasted with how we think of Latinidad, and her Latinidad was made invisible. The racial computations of Latinidad are obvious. One can be Latina like Zimmerman, or like Sofia Vergara, or like J-Lo, or like Justice Sonia Sotomayor. But Chantel's Black Latino-ness remains invisible because alternative, one can be Black, and this is often deduced as African American, like Rachel Chantel or Trayvon, or like Arturo Alfonso Schomburg there on the top left, or like Elvis Nolasco, actor Elvis Nolasco on the bottom right, or like Reggie Jackson, Reginald Martinez Jackson, the baseball player famous in the 80s, or Black like Tatiana Ali, there in the middle, or Black like our own Black Latinas No Collective colleague, Ariana Curtis, which I encourage everyone to see her Crucial Tech Dog, or Black like me. So Blackness has been historically kicked out of Latinidad all over the Americas. From early on mestizaje claims by people like Martí, Cuban Martí, who said we're not Black, we're not white, we're Cuban, claiming the Americas as a site of mestizaje, has led to resistance to identify as Black, although not necessarily not identify as white, for many different reasons. And these reasons vary across time, but have resulted in Blackness being made invisible. That has yielded this sort of like café au lait, you know, Latino profile. But it's surprising that Blacks would be invisible given how many of us there are. So we really need a reassessment of what Latinx is and the place Blackness holds in Latinx. I always start with this graphic on the right in order to reset history for my students. And as you see, more than 95% of people captured and enslaved were brought from Africa to somewhere in Latin America. less than 5% went to what is now the United States and Canada. And this is often very surprising to my students, although history makes it obvious, right? The portal of Blackness was the Caribbean. And so this should not be any surprise. This is where that violence began, which is more than violence, but that's how it began. So today, there are over 130 million people of African descent living in Latin America, which is about 1/4 of the total population, according to the Project on Ethnicity and Race in Latin America, Pearl at Princeton University. So it makes it outrageous that Latin Americans are so keen on erasing us from the national consciousness, given the numbers, as you can see on the left map. It makes it even more outrageous, I think, that Latin Americans and Latinxes, even in the US, find it amusing and surprising to find Spanish-speaking Black people, as I often experience when I speak Spanish. The question goes, how do you learn Spanish? And of course, Latinidad is not only defined by Spanish, but there is a sense that Black people cannot participate culturally or linguistically in a Latinx setting. When actually speaking Spanish to any Black person you see in Latin America or in Latinx spaces is actually the safest bet, over assuming they don't speak English and are foreign. So Black people exist in Latin America, and they also, exist in the US, Black Latinos. And the numbers are smaller, but between 1980 to 2010, census figures show that consistently Black Latinos represent at least almost 3% of the Latinx population. So while many Latinos prefer to identify as white, that has varied, that has been on decline between 1980 and 2010, started at 63% and has gone down to 53%. And another portion of Latinos choosing to identify as some other race. But certainly the numbers are there, and the questions are why the numbers aren't higher. And these numbers are in flux, and I'll talk a little bit more about why. So Blackness finds its way to Latinidad in the term Afro-Latinx. The semantics of Afro-Latinx versus Black Latinx is a whole discussion of its own. Suffice to say that they have been used interchangeably with very recent controversies, which I will in a moment go into. But I want to offer a history and drawing from the Afro-Latino Reader, this journal text by my dear late friends, Miriam Jimenez Roman and Juan Flores, edited this really important collection that details the history of Afro-Latinidad in the US and offer the notion that this is not a new thing. It didn't come out of nowhere. Contrary to some popular opinion, late in the 19th and earlier 20th century, we see some of the very early kind of seeds being placed for Afro-Latinidad, with movements like Pan-Africanism that sought to unite those of African descent and non-white people globally. And then we have the 1920s and 30s movements like the Negritude movement, the Harlem Renaissance, and Afro-Cubanismo really lay the groundwork for this conscious articulation of a Blackness, of a Black Latinidad within the context of the US. In the from the 1950s to the 1980s, we see African liberation movements and global decolonization processes, civil rights, Black power in the US, all that if we investigate deeper, we see that Black Latinos and Afro-Latinos were participating in such, even if they might have been using different terms to describe themselves. In the 1970s in Latin America, there were anti-racist organizations and congresos that emerged that really frame a continental context. So the hemispheric and transnational context of these struggles have been always there. And we see simultaneously a negotiation of terms in the US from Negro and color to Black, Afro-American and African-Americans as terms that are being negotiated along a demographic increase of Latin America and Caribbeans in the US, and the emergence of a Hispanic and Latino pan-ethnic identity that starts to be kind of negotiated also for Latinos. And so conjoined with things like the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa in the 1980s, which creates a global interest in the realities of racism on a global scale, right? Not only in certain parts, really launches the term Africa diaspora, connecting all people of African descent, which are about 180 million in the Americas. So terms like negro, afrodescendiente, afro-latinoamericano, afro-latino, to identify many movements and causes against racism are articulated. And these are cemented in 2001 with the World Conference Against Racism convened by UNESCO in Durban, South Africa. And Afro-Latino really comes through these transnational self-affirmations. And this is important to recognize because it connects, it really makes real a sense of the diaspora and connection across spheres of Black life, right? It's not geographically limited. And so other terms like Afro-Latina, Afrodescendiente, Afro-Venezolana, Afro-Dominicana that are specific to certain communities also, you know, sort of participate in this articulation of racial kind of consciousness and pride. And in the US, these terms also help signal the contradictions within a pan-ethnic term that really erases important racial, cultural, and socioeconomic differences. So it really calls into attention not only differences, but also anti-Black racism within Latinx communities. And it pins Afro-Latinidad as those who are visibly or self-proclaim as being of African descent. So really articulating like that which Frantz Fanon brings out, the fact of Blackness, right? This is not simply a recognition, but it's also a claim of inequities and oppression that is being created through the prism of race. So we have this sort of term that emerges out of a recognition of inequities and also a celebration of an identity that remains oppressed and marginal, that then starts to be used in a broader way. And a recent Pew Research Center survey found that currently about a quarter of Latinos identify as Afro-Latinos, but once they are asked about race, those same who identify as Afro-Latinos, many identify as white, right? Like, which seems contradictory. But what it does is it creates kind of differential meanings around these terms of Black Latinx and Afro-Latinx. So Afro-Latinx can look like Amara La Negra on the left or Gina Rodriguez on the right, or I don't know. Yeah, I think it looks the same way for you all. And Gina Rodriguez is shown here with her father because upon getting some pushback about some anti-Black claims, she says she couldn't be anti-Black because her father was an Afro-Latino. So Afro-Latino cannot exist in her version with anti-Blackness. And this contrast between Amara La Negra and Gina Rodriguez is, I think, what the difference that some social scientists have been trying to get at, and what Nancy Lopez has termed the difference between what she terms street race, that is, street race is how you believe other Americans perceive your race at the level of the street. It's pedestrian. It's not necessarily some process of identification or thought, but it's actually how you're perceived, which is akin to Frantz Fanon's fact of Blackness, right? Versus what I call tu abuela donde está race, that references a root and mestizaje and an ancestor as the source of Blackness, which is more, I suggest, an identity-based celebration. So we have at the heart of this contrast is this question of whether Latinos, Latinxes are a race. Many Latinos actually choose to select their ethnicity as their race, but if we think about social science, we might start to question this a bit. This is a picture of Amara La Negra, contrast to the Gina Rodriguez picture, with her mother and her father. And note that the caption says Amara La Negra with her Latina mom on the left and her Black dad on the right, when both her parents are Dominican. So there is a sense that ethnicity and race are equivalent. But as social scientists, we question this equivalency, this conflation. And some suggest that a definition that Cornell and Hartman offers, that ethnicity can be thought about as a sense of common ancestry based on cultural attachments, linguistic heritage, current or past, a religious affiliation, claimed kinship, or some physical traits. Whereas race is mostly largely defined, and if we take Nancy Lopez's version, it's in concert with this, is mostly defined and determined by physical characteristics, whereas ethnicity is more about person's culture, language, family, and place of origin, which nationalities are thrown in the mix too, making ethnicity more about place, geography, nestedness. Race remains a more physically determined concept. But both are socially defined. They are both social constructs. Neither is biologically valid. But social scientists have found that people are more likely to self-identify with multiple ethnicities than multiple races. So clearly there's a mixed race movement that moves in away from that. But still, most people choose one race. So it's important to note that race, unlike ethnicity, is still mostly a term that is assigned by other groups, and that there is a claim of superiority inherent to the concept of race, and racial identity is usually considered inherent, like you cannot choose what you are. And for example, you know, we can think of the recent example of Jessica Krug. So race, unlike ethnicity, is considered still mostly a term that is assigned by other groups and not something that people can choose, as this case of Jessica Krug. And Eduardo Bonilla Silva has suggested that ethnicization invokes the language of place, where are you from, while race invokes the language of phenotype, what are you? And do that race, and that race is a way of otherizing, while ethnicity is mostly a form of distinction that often, but not exclusively, but often, and these are Eduardo Bonilla Silva's proposition, holds a negative connotation. So we see that, in fact, on the right, we see that 7 in 10 Latinos choose only to be Latinx when presented with a combined ethnicity race question, which is something that the census has been entertaining for some years, to combine, to make Latinx parallel to ethnicity. So if we're all Black and we're all Afro-Latinos, or a quarter of us, then how do we deal with inequities born by race? How do we deal with thinking of Amara La Negra as not being seen as a person generally who's considered Latinx compared to Gina Rodriguez? If we're all Black, then how do we deal with inequities? How do we deal with education, income, and health disparities that research shows is true by race among Latinxes? How do we answer this burning question I've had since 2015 that points to race and ethnicity as an intersection, and gender as well? So how do we understand that if white women make 77 cents to white men's dollar, Black women make 64 cents, and Latina women make 54 cents to the white man's dollar, how much of a dollar do I make, or does a Black Latina woman make? So there is a lot of evidence that Latinos who appear white or are white have improved life chances. They have gains in education, economics, politics, class, and the general socioeconomic opportunity structure. For example, based on research, Afro-Latinos are significantly more supportive of government-sponsored healthcare and significantly less supportive of the death penalty than Latinos identifying as white. Moreover, when assessing their commonality with non-Latinx Blacks and whites, Afro-Latinas feel significantly closer to African Americans, whereas Latinas feel significantly closer to whites. Conversely, racially Black Latinxes face the same racial disadvantage that local US Black populations encounter. Borrell has labeled the discrimination that Afro-Latinxes encounter a double jeopardy, where they face the racism from white Americans as well as white Latinxes. So Black Latinos in the US experience similar negative effects from racism as local Black populations, and studies have corroborated that compared to white Latinos, Black Latinas experience higher levels and more forms of discrimination, have lower socioeconomic profiles, less education, and occupations with less prestige are more segregated and have deleterious health effects related to discrimination. And researchers have been able to ascertain some of the racial differences within Latinos, in part because of the availability of data that asks Latinos to identify themselves ethnically, Latino or not, and racially, white, Black, Asian, other. Following the US Census lead, many national data sets mimic the two separate questions of race and ethnicity, even though they're not perfect. And actually, the Afro-Latino Forum has been conducting a survey of race among Latinos, and we will be, over the years, presenting what we're finding in that survey. So these two separate questions of race and ethnicity facilitate analysis that reveal in greater nuances the axis on which social inequality along the lines of race rests for Latinos. But for the last few years, the census has been entertaining removing the race option for Latinos, conflating them into one racial group. Our knowledge of the vast differences in social experience that race creates in the Latino experience is actually threatened, because conflating the race and ethnicity question to count Latinos undifferentiated with respect to race elides the powerful and active presence of race and color and colorism among this population and in US society. So to be Latinx and fair skinned in the US and in Latin America has privileges that are unattainable and restricted to Black Latinxes. And ignoring these differences, and more importantly, not being able to document them, would have grave consequences. So we would be unable, for example, to document and understand why Black Latinxes don't have the protective factor against hypertension that epidemiologists have located in the general Latinx population. So as again, Luisa Borel's study shows, when we separate Latinos out by race and observe average protective health factor of the Latinx population disappears. Black Latinos, Borel shows, suffer from similar levels of hypertension as non-Hispanic Blacks. So, and when not measured, the health disadvantages of Latinos becomes an artifact of ignoring race, because it's actually race that is operating rather than ethnic Latinidad in the deleterious impacts on health. So not counting race in the Latinx population creates, and to use Borel's terms, an artifact that distorts our understanding of Latinx experience and veils important and consequential social differences, misshaping policy that distribute opportunities for a more fair and humane life for all Latinos, not just the white and cafe au lait ones. So again, to not count race for Latinos creates these artifacts, which are illusions of sameness and equality, and proposes a fictive white Latino world, much like the one that we see represented in media, that portrays light-skinned Latinos as able to summarily capture, but also wash away the experience of Black and dark Latinos, and offer a generic sort of whitened Latino as representative of Latinidad. So I started with the Trayvon Martin case, and today, as the Breonna Taylor shooters are not facing charges for her murder, we just learned, the question of how we make sure that Black lives matter and are recognized globally within Latin America and among Latinx communities remains center stage. And for that, we need some clarity as to not only how we measure race, but how our actions contribute or take away from a fight for racial equality in all its manifestations. Relevant to our student community, in her study of Afro-Latinos on campus, Jasmine Haywood notes that her interviews identify Latino spaces as the most violent for Afro-Latinos in a college campus. And I think any of us who have gone through college campuses as Black Latinos can speak to this, right? The experience of walking into a Latinx room and not being recognized or being directed to the African American room, or being asked why we're there, or being questioned or questioned about our membership in Latinidad. So this requires further thoughts and requires thinking about we're so ready to accept and even celebrate Latinidad in anything but Blackness, including whiteness, as in the potential 45th President's possible Supreme Court Justice nominee, Barbara Lagoa, there on the left, while we refuse to recognize Black Latinxes like Rachel Gentile as our brethren, or remain quiet when Omar Jimenez, there on the right, a Black Latino, CNN reported, is arrested in Minneapolis. And that becomes news for, in the context of race, but not necessarily among the Latino community. So the question is, who belongs? How do we acknowledge that race matters, Black lives matter, Black Latino lives matters, las vidas negras latinas importan. So I will end there and look forward to a conversation, discussion, questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dinzey-Flores. This has been an incredibly insightful lecture, and I am really excited to open it up to a Q&A session.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Dinzey-Flores, for an amazing genealogical presentation on Afro-Latinidad. I'm just sitting in awe because I just literally thinking about the pedagogical approach and like thinking particularly about within the field of Latinx studies, which seems to still be really stubborn around Blackness and seems to be really stubborn still about the existence of Black Latinx folks, that I'm thinking about what has been your experience, particularly thinking about Mestizo students taking your courses, but also even meeting Black Latinx students who may not identify or know of their Blackness, particularly because within the context of the US, Black seems to be persistently synonymous with African American. And I'm thinking about the context of the East Coast, and I'm even thinking about the context of New York City, that so many Black Latinos generationally have always kind of had this conflict with African American identification through Black, right? That Black seems to mean that, and that doesn't capture their identity. So just kind of thinking about what have you experienced? How would you approach that in the classroom and outside?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Dr. Lopez Oro, and for being present. And shout out to Dr. Lopez Oro, who's a Smith and fantastic Afro-Latinx scholar, doing amazing work and making a lot of important interventions into the work of Afro-Latinidad, but also Garifuna and urban Black Latinidad. So thank you for being here. You know, I think there are different things moving around this issue of how to not only navigate, but also articulate, like give voice to the experience of Black Latinxes that may not necessarily have had the experience of naming themselves racially in these ways because of the power of, I think, the Latino mestizaje trope. And I have actually come across students and some who've gone on to pursue this as a topic of research in graduate school, who have just never seen the language or the experiences reflected to legitimize their claim to Blackness, right? Because, and this is specifically for those who are darker and have had the experience, right, but don't have the language necessarily to speak of it in that way. And this is partly because of the foothold, right? Like and that's why I show that slide of, you know, most of Africans went elsewhere, right? It's not to try and one up, because it's not a good one-upping, right? Like,
right, exactly.
The experience of Africans in the US, but globally, the message is that especially hemispheric American Blackness is lived as African American. And that's something that not only is those messages are not only in the US, but are everywhere, are globally, even in Latin America.
Absolutely.
People think if you're Black, you're African American. And so I think that a lot of the work I do in presenting this material is to let people see themselves. And I think I've seen people say like, oh, wait a second, I'm Black, right? Like I've seen students go through that. And it's not that they started being Black in that moment. And my Jomaira Salas Pujols, who's doing this work, her dissertation work at Rutgers in sociology, has been looking at Afro-Latinas and the way in which they may have not articulated, may have not said Black, but their experiences are Black. And so we have to, in some ways, disentangle this identity and experience thing, and not necessarily demand that Blackness comes in certain languages, right, with certain terms, but really attach it to experience. And that's why I mean, as a sociologist as well, I think this is true, to try and hold tight to the experience, right? To what does the evidence tell us? So regardless of what people call themselves, because if we make Afro-Latinidad subject to a term, to an identity, then we run the risk, right, of kind of diffusing the necessary archiving and the necessary study and investigation into inequality. So I have had that. On the mestizo student side, I think it's also a wake-up call, right? Like, what are the implications of recognizing that there are a range of racial experiences within Latinidad that we need to acknowledge, right? And it creates some conflicts because there is, I mean, arguably, there is a racialized type of experiences within Latinidad, right? But specifying that is really important, I think, right? So how does language work? How does color work? How does, right? But I think a lot of times everything is bundled up, right, in the concept of race. And of course, race is a fiction. So yes, it bundles up things that from everywhere. But we really have to challenge this, especially given how mestizaje and that mixingness works as a way to put down kind of any suggestion of inequality and difference. So I think it's a challenge for mestizo students. as well, but more of a challenge is the fact that they've never seen this material, right? That it's the first time kind of confronting that material. But I'd love to hear what you do. So.
No, thank you. No, this is so much. Yeah, no, I really appreciate it. It's a lot of work, and I'm so grateful to be in your company and in the space. It's a lot of work, and it feels like it's centuries worth of work, right? In terms of really shifting the paradigm. I think mestizaje is still very much alive and well. And if you know the root of mestizaje being one of anti-Blackness and an anti-indigeneity. Yeah, you see that in every breath of Latinidad in the Americas. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So I see that there are other questions, and there's one. Clara, is it okay if I go, or do you want to field those questions?
Yes, please go ahead. I'm actually wondering what to do about the Google form. I'm wondering if I could send them to you directly through chat, and you can look through them and see if there are any that you'd like to answer.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, so there's a question about, can we actively work to resist an invisibilization of Black Afro-Latinxes in the US, especially in politics and public policy? I mean, that is my field. This is precisely why data is so incredibly important. At the moment that we say we should not question, we should not ask race, we should conflate race with ethnicity, then that steals or takes away the ability for Black Latinos and for all Latinos to understand how race functions for us. So I gave some examples of how this informs health policy, right? If you end up then averaging to the most privileged Latinos, then you fail to see the disenfranchised Latinos in that formulation. So data is one of the very important things, especially given policy data, which also means that we have to be vigilant about how we think of ourselves racially, right, in the context of certain situations, and advocated for kind of like a context-driven scenario. So there are situations in which mestizo experience is very close to Black Latino experience relative to those who are fair-skinned, who I call white Latinos, right? Like that, there are instances when that is the case. Certainly we can think of immigration context when, you know, where that may operate, right? But there are situations where Black Latinidad is exclusively in the darkest, right? That you see the difference between Gentile and the juror B29, where only the darkest and clearly, you know, what we call visibly Black only come under attack or are invisibilized. So we have to think about the different policy contexts. And then on a daily basis, I think it's important for Latinos to look around them because, you know, there is a persistent exclusion of Black faces from Latinx spaces. It's common, you know, for me, there's no place, professional place that I've been that names itself a Latinx space that where I have not been one of one or one of two or one of a few. So I think it's important for, to think about the ways in which we think about hiring, employment, opportunities, education, in ways that that doesn't just simply think about like, oh, Latinx representation, but Latinx representation along Black lines, along Indigenous lines, right? So opening to always keep the race question center, which means disaggregating data, keeping the race and ethnicity question always separate. There is another question: in what ways can member of the African American community can members of the African American community aid in the understanding of Blackness, Afro-Latinx, and Africanism? Yeah, I mean, this is a great question. I think, you know, who I consider kind of like an intellectual, you know, kind of role model, the late Miriam Jimenez Roman speaks of the way in which African Americans have really been the forerunners and really set the stage for racial equity in the United States, and which we rely, right? Like we rely on the efforts of African Americans for the gains in racial equity, any gains in racial equity in the context of the United States. And I think it's important that we kind of understand the historical diasporic connections, right, of all people of African descent in the Americas. Our relationships, our parallel histories, our common histories. I think that one of the ways in which we often elide the diversity of the Black experience, and I think that is one way to maintain it and to understand that Blackness is lived in the Americas in different tempos, in different modes, in different languages, in different cultures, and to investigate that. I think that there's a friction between the sense of you know, the one drop rule US relative to the experience of Blackness in among Latinos and in Latin America and the Caribbean, where race, I think, goes a lot by phenotype. And so to consider, I think, equity for Afro-Latinidad, I think also relies on going, kind of thinking critically of the ways in which the racial schema that has like sold in the US interfaces with other racial schemas. And I think that that's the challenge for all of us, right? To kind of have those conversations in the open. And so I feel I haven't fully answered that question, but I think it's important to kind of like recognize the diasporic and to learn, you know, kind of like the different modes by which Blackness is experienced and lived diasporically. And then this question about, in what ways do you see Afro-Latinxes aligning themselves with the BLM movement, and how do you think this connection continues the work of rupturing whitened notions of Latinidad? So, you know, one way to think about this, and I actually may want Professor Lopez Oros to come back and say something. I'm like, I didn't, you know, inviting you into the panel, but if he's still around. But I think that, oh, you are, great. I think that the Black Lives Matter movement, you know, in way it has established as full of, especially the movement for Black lives, there's different language that's being used, right? That includes a diverse range of Black beings and experiences, and I think that one way that it has been, I think, misrepresented is the suggestion that when we say Black, we only mean Americans. And I don't think that the movement necessarily or the participants in it ever see it in that way. But this notion, I think, became clear, and this is why I want to bring Lopez Oro in, because he was one of the first to identify this problematic expression of Latinos for Black lives, right? Because that excludes the notion that Black ever meant not Latinos. And so, in that already implied and involved in the Black Lives Matter movement. So I'm gonna pass the mic to Lopez Oro for any additional thoughts on that.
So I'm so sorry, I definitely missed it. What's the recap?
Yeah, no, so I'm sorry, I'm like putting you at, but no,
you're fine, you're fine.
Question about the BLM movement and Afro-Latinos aligning themselves with the BLM movements. And I was saying how you were one of the first persons, I think, to make a note of that, Latinx lives, the problematic nature of that.
Oh, yeah. Okay, thank you. Yes. Yeah, so it was really frustrating to see that circulate in social media, because it really just reiterated this notion that Latinidad was perpetually non-Black, right? That this notion of like literally, Black Latinos are in the Black Lives Matter movement, right? And in fact, the Black Lives Matter movement is a hemispheric one, right? Thinking, about Colombia, thinking about the different cases, even Reconocido in DR, right? Like these are projects of Black Lives Always Mattering, and Black Latinos have been part of that project. And the slogan Latinos for Black Lives Matter really erases and silences the political, intellectual, spiritual labor that Afro-Latinx folks have been doing with the BLM movement.
Yeah, and recirculates, I mean, I think as the question rightly frames, recirculates this wider notions of Latinidad, that's mutual exclusivity that has of Black and Latino, this understanding that is true, I think, of Latinidad, that when people say Black, they mean, African Americans, and that they're, that we don't exist in our own backyard, right? Like in our own home, we're not visible. So Afro-Latinx have always been aligned with the Black Lives Matter movement. In fact, the history I offer, right, like that genealogy speaks to that global history, that those Afrodescendiente movements, those Pan-Africanism, all of that speaks to the fact that this is Black Lives Matter, las vidas negras importan, and that's why I put them. And in all languages, it has been a persistent struggle from the moment, right, of bondage, from the moment of bondage.
Absolutely. And a little bit around the danger of that slogan in particular, that it creates this Black-Brown solidarity moment that is really, urgent, necessary, and important. But once again, it's the reinscription of the Latinx always being non-Black, right? The impossibility of Blackness and Latinidad, right? That's really frustrating. And then there's this moment where Afro-Latinos become folkloric, right? They become a salsa, they become a merengue. They're, you want to talk about Afro-Latinx culture, but you don't want to talk about the political movements, right? You don't want to talk about El Partido de Independiente de Color in Cuba that was massacred, right? To deeply understand hemispheric Black political movements, right? Yeah, sorry, I'm done.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you so much, Pablo, for bringing in, I think, an important voice, loud voice to the problematic nature. It also speaks to being aware of language, right? Like the way in which we use language in ways that like reify this mestizo, lightened, whitened Latinidad, and how we use that. And I think this is reflected in so many ways, the ways in which Black Latinidad is invisibilized and killed and dead and non-existent in the way we speak of Latinidad and Blackness. There's another question. What are the next steps in addressing the spread of imperialism in the world from an American perspective when it comes to Blackness means? And this same person asked about many people about proximity to whiteness, in which we often try to eliminate. Not often do we talk about how we try to determine people's proximity to Blackness from a white lens. How can that push Afro-Latinos heard and seen as needed? I'm not sure I get the second question, but the first question, I think it's a real question. So the American perspective when it comes to what Blackness means and how that's linked to imperialism. I mean, I think that, you know, empire and colonization as a central part of the story is important. I think that there is a potential pitfall to sort of handle colonization as an empire, the American empire, as the one that produces race. And so, like, in dehistoricizes the production of Blackness as occurring, you know, from 1492, right? From the very beginning of European colonization. And so it doesn't take, you know, 400 more years till 1898 when the US, you know, kind of like cements its status as an empire for Blackness and racial oppression to happen. In fact, you know, it had been happening for a long time. So that is the danger, I think, in some of these conversations. And I say that because often, and this is true for many scholars of race in the context of Latin America or among Latinxs, that they think that the claims of racism and racial inequality are born out of an experience in the US. And I think that really is a reflection of people who are relatively experienced racially, who then think of racism in the context of the US as something new. Maybe sometimes when they experience it anew, they think, oh, this is where it comes from, when they might have been perpetrating it in their own sense. So I think there is a troubled thing there. And then the other thing is kind of like, how do we define Blackness and the experience of Blackness, and how empire also contributes to that. American empire, US empire contributes to that by like denoting the standards, right, of being as being centrally defined by in the US in every way. So there's of course power has kind of animates, right? Power and capitalism animates the spreading of a US culture as the standard, as the desirable, right? And that also includes kind of like the kind of packaged allusions to Black experience, and that is not always positive. That's also, it comes with the anti-African American portions as well, and racist notions, right, of what African American culture is, but it also comes with some standards of what African Americanness you know, how that represents kind of like a Blackness. So we here, we're more prone to think of Black experience as defined by, you know, urban centers in the US rather than maybe urban centers in Panama or urban centers in Brazil, right? Or rural centers, rural areas as well, depending on where you're talking about. So that, you know, let's say, and I'm trying to pull at some cultural references, but maybe Los Palos, as performed in Dominican Republic, doesn't get kind of exposed as an African, you know, or black music, and it's sort of like sold under this mestizaje trope compared to you know, let's say, well, jazz has relinquished its, right, its status as necessarily, but not hasn't relinquished, has been taken as a Black music, but maybe, you know, hip hop or ways of being in Black US. So I hope I kind of answer that and to some degree. And you can please include in the chat or say if you think there's more or you have some thoughts more about it. This interesting question, which I don't think Christopher Fleming is asking, that I don't think I fully grasp, but how we try to determine people's proximity to Blackness from a white lens. How can that push and pull that Afro-Latinx people experience be heard and seen as needed? How we, I'm sorry, I don't fully grasp the question. So if you can explain further, but I'm intrigued by this piece that you write about proximity to Blackness from a white lens. I'm intrigued by that. So if more, I'd love to think about it. Christopher Fleming, if you're still in the chat. So I'm gonna move on to Prof. Annie Mendez, another colleague, also who I remember fondly because we were at U of M together. Asked that while you were presenting, media recognizes or erases Latinx Blackness vis-a-vis Amara La Negra and Gina Rodriguez, I couldn't avoid the controversy over Zoe Saldaña's problematic portrayal of Nina Simone. I wonder if you could comment a bit more on the intricacies of Blackness as it centers on Afro-Latinx communities and how we can establish more direct and critical dialogues with Afro-American communities. So I think the prior question a little bit spoke to that, and Professor Dani Mendez, if you want to speak to this too, I think this is your research as well. I welcome hearing other voices and hearing your voice. Gina Rodriguez recently came back because she had defended her, Zoe Saldaña recently came back because she had defended her portrayal of Nina Simone until now. And I think that, I actually think that I don't like it how she got out of it, because I think the challenges made of her were more than about whether she was Black. I think that some of it was simplistically kind of put forth. I think that there was some people who wanted to challenge that, and I think Zoe Saldaña didn't do a good job in sort of educating in the ways that she was Black. But I think the challenges were more than about Blackness were about prideful Blackness, a particular dark, you know, kind of experience of who Nina Simone was, and her celebration of Blackness that I think Zoe Saldaña sort of recognizes now, and we have to take into account colorism and what does it do to think, you know, that you have to, in order to present Blackness, subscribe to certain caricatured notions of Blackness. And so she had, what do you call that? She added prostheses and things like that to make herself kind of more Black or more like Nina Simone. And I think that she just didn't know how to handle that. And I think about the times in which I'm faced with questions from African Americans about my own Blackness, and questions come in this type of way. They find out because, you know, my name, if you don't hear the Flores or you don't see the Flores, people might think that's my mother's last name, but they might attribute it to marriage or something like that. But, you know, they don't know me, so they don't know I wouldn't do that. But I'm cited Dinzey-Flores. If it's just cited Dinzey, they say, oh, I thought you were Black, when they find out I'm Latinx, and I say I'm still Black. Like, I've always been Black, and I think that history has to be revisited, right? I mean, I happen to be, my ancestors happen to be Black from the site where the first Africans were brought into the Americas, right? From the genesis of this Blackness, this type of Blackness. So I think that there was an education that Zoe Saldaña missed, was unable to make, but also was unable to make because she failed to understand the other layered concepts of colorism and stereotyping, and Nina Simone's sort of strong Black, specific Black pride that was being forged, that she was, I think, timid to face. So I'm gonna shut up, and maybe you wanna say something.
Hola.
Hola.
¿Cómo está? Bueno, I'm having mic issues, so I'll be brief. I totally agree. I'm here like screaming and totally agreeing with you here, but no se podía oír. Yeah, so that was, I heard the apology and I read the apology from Zoe Saldaña, and in retrospect, it just, yeah, it was a missed opportunity for her, right, to learn and to educate herself on what an Afro-Latina perspective would be while interpreting such an iconic and important figure as Nina Simone, right? So, completamente de acuerdo. Thank you, Saide.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry to put you in the spot, but I love hearing your voice too. So
yeah,
thank you. And I should invite, Christopher Fleming. Yes, if I would love, I don't know you, but I would love to hear your thoughts on the question you're putting forth. Or is it Christopher? So the question to return, many people.
I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay. Go ahead.
Apologize. I'm sorry. I'm also in class.
Oh, okay. Okay, so your question restated, many people talk about proximity to whiteness, in which we often try to eliminate, but not often do we talk about how we, Black people, try to determine people's proximity to Blackness. How do we change this? So I think this came into play with the recent sort of, imposter, Jessica Krug, and kind of performative idea of Afro-Latinidad and the ways in which, many people then were really many Black people, not only Black Latinos, but Black, were sort of, had been defending her or supporting her Blackness to some others' questions, and then felt like they were violated and their trust was compromised. And the many of that was, people policing the boundaries of Blackness. And I think about it as very differently. I think that Blackness, there's Paul Mooney, who has this famous joke. I think the late comedian who, problematic in many ways, but he had this joke about everybody want to be Black, nobody want to be Black. He used different words, but that was the sentiment about it. I think that it's not necessarily about policing the boundaries of Blackness, but, and I hope I'm interpreting your question correctly, but it's about thinking of being protective, right? Because I think there's a way in which Blackness can get kind of thrown around as and especially in this context, and I think, racial dollars are all these racial, kind of imposters fully demonstrate, it comes with certain, with certain powers, or for some people, right? Used in certain ways, it can grant power. And usually I think when indicative of how it can be really harmful, the types of power that are really hard for people who actually experience the world as Black. So I think that it's about a protection, a commonality, and making community, rather than a challenge of it's are you Black enough or are you not Black enough? And I think this is the other thing. I think that Black ways of knowing are not sufficiently shared, or they're continuously kind of put down, especially in the context of Latinidad. I think there's always a push of validating kind of the experience of Blackness, of saying, this is how it feels, this is how it looks, this is what I experience. It's always, it's often challenged. And I think that often the ones that go unchallenged are the ones that are to some degree inauthentic, right? Because they sound about right, or they conform to the very stereotypes of those who might see Blackness as something that is only about fashion, performance, stigma. So I think there are many meanings circulating, and that many people, most people, have a notion of how they understand Blackness, and if it doesn't conform to that, then they tear it down, or if it challenges their own position, they tear it down, when in fact a lot of these experiences of Blackness are real, but often we keep them quiet because we're often challenged. I hope that makes sense. It's a little convoluted, but I think it's not an easy experience. I'll say a concrete example. For example, a lot of the conversation around Jessica Cruz and pointing to, to rape and drug use and whatever, some of the conversations among Black Latinos were if we have that kind of experience in our background, we're not shouting it out, we're not sharing it, because in our skin, in our experience, that's actually a mechanism to exclude us. So to be shouting it out speaks to a certain non-Black experience, right? That conforms to white kind of sense of what Black experience really looks like. So I hope that made sense. And then, hi, Larry, Professor LaFontaine-Stokes. You asked, I was wondering if you have any additional suggestions or experiences regarding the Latinx Studies classroom and Latinx Studies, suggestions or thoughts as to how to continue to integrate, expand, and transform our classes and field. I have many thoughts. I mean, I think that the Black Latinas Know collective that we have is precisely trying to intervene in this way. It's also to say that, you know, Black Latinidad is not homogeneous, it's diverse, it's varied. Like, we think differently. There are many of us. Well, there are not enough of us, but there are many of us. But we're underrepresented in the spaces of Latinx studies and Latinx field. And I think that part of it is to take us at our word, like take us at our word. Latinx studies has been defined by a non-Black kind of kind of thought, and I think there needs to be an intentional way of including the voices of those who of Black Latinxes in the conversation, and I think there. You know, we can talk about the classroom, we can talk about our faculty, we can talk about the students, we can talk about, you know, the academic landscape, largely written that, you know, including conferences and journals and publishing and all of that, and the ways in which Blackness has been kind of kept at bay or pushed back, or even, you know, we don't get to speak in our own voices. I understand that many scholars want to do the race work and do the race work, and there are many dimensions to the race work, but one important dimension is also like how the epistemological, the position of Black Latinidad and making sure that that becomes visible and it's part of the conversation, if not the protagonist of the conversation. So I think that's important, and I see that kind of like slowly moving in that direction. How do you make sense of, are we done? Are we over time?
Yeah, I'm so sorry, we're over time, but if you wish to continue with the last questions in the Q&A, that's completely fine. You know, it's up to you.
Okay, I only see one more, I think, in the Q&A, unless
Yes.
I'm missing some on the chat. Am I missing the chat?
There are 23 questions in the chat, so I feel like we're gonna have to.
We're gonna have to. So let me. Can I just quickly read quickly, just some of them, and maybe I'll just say a final word.
Yes, please. Whatever you'd prefer.
Okay, so thank you so much for the questions. I wish we had like another, you know, hour to to continue the conversation. Thanks so much for the engagement. There were some questions about like choices in terms of identifying to not play into the white, black binary for brown folk, or that see themselves as brown. I think even that identification we might kind of like question. And then, or those people who identify as some other race. And I'll speak to that because I think that this is at the crux of really being able to understand what's going on. And it's, you know, the work around the census is terribly important. And the reason that the census has been entertaining the notion of, you know, making Latinos a race is because, as you saw in the figures, about, you know, from a third to a half of Latinos kind of escape the race question by saying, oh, I'm some other race, I'm something else. Don't put me in your US box of Black and Latino. But the trouble with that is that is not, that's basically lost data. If you're some other race, it means that we don't know what you are. We don't know how you live, how your race informs your experience. So while it might seem like a really brave and rebellious move, that kind of that guarantees that your identity and your sense of self is represented, it ends up washing away any understanding we have about racial inequality. So our most trusted opportunity to get a sense of how race operates in your experience is to try and find yourself within one of those boxes. So if you do survey research or this kind of research, the other option is a wash. It doesn't hold meaning. We don't know how to interpret that. And this is the challenge is, how do you navigate that? So there are some options. You can choose more than one race. And it's not, race is a fiction. We know that race is a fiction, right? It's a biological fiction, but it's a social reality. It operates, it informs people. And what we've been trying to push, and Nancy Lopez has really done a lot of work, is to really rethink this question of the census, to not tap into identity. People can feel whatever they want, right? Like about who they are, but to tap into the racial experience, right? That's why she proposes street race or ascribed race. And so what I would say is the census and these forms are about measuring inequality. And if you derive some colorist privileges from, you know, your physical, your phenotype, then nobody's saying that you are denying your Blackness or your indigeneity, but it's reflective possibly of the opportunities you have. And then you can choose more than one, but the boxes really are the ones that are gonna give us useful information. This is not a test of identity or of who you are or what your heart really feels. It's a test of how socially race has been used in to discriminate and or offer opportunities. And this is the way we know. This is the way we guarantee we get the right information to address racial inequality. It's a longer conversation, and I am sorry that we don't have more time, and I'm gonna look through all of the questions because I think it's important to kind of like be in touch with, you know, the things that this this brings up, these conversations bring up. So thank you so much for participating and for engaging me and hearing me out. And if I welcome you to email me, and even if you have some disagreements, I would love to hear those too, because I think it's important to understand the range of experiences. And I actually, invite all of you, invite the students, especially, to become part of knowledge producers, to bring your, whether in a full agreement or disagreement, to bring yourself and your experience into the production of how we understand race, because we need more minds, we need more people from diverse experiences to contribute to the knowledge production and to the conversation. So thank you for having me.
I just want to say thank you so much for being here, Dr. Dinzey-Flores. This has been incredibly illuminating, and everything that you say is so important to understand, especially, from the perspective of myself being a non-Black Latina in the community. I think it's imperative that all the people, like me, who don't consider themselves Black but are Latinos should, absolutely take into account our privilege and our identity in the ways that, our identity has been, an oppressive, an oppressive factor throughout history, and, just like a contributing factor to so many, levels of hegemony. So definitely, thank you so much for everything that you've said. And yeah, I just also want to extend my thanks to all the people who have submitted questions. I apologize that we could not get to all of them. I agree, this was way too short of a time to discuss the incredibly wide breadth of information that could be discussed right now. But I will send out an not an RSVP form, but a post-event survey to everybody who RSVP'd in order to help MESA, which is the Office of Multi-Ethnic Student Affairs, receive feedback, and also get the university to give us more funding for more events like this in the future. And if anybody would like to request a recording of this event, please feel free to contact me at cpnureg@umich.edu. I have a recording, and if you have any other questions, you can contact me, and I would be happy to, provide you with the resources that you may need. So thank you so much, Dr. Dinzey-Flores, and yeah, I'm going to end the meeting here if that's all right with everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you again. Have a great rest of your evening.
Thank you,
You
Dr.
too.
Flores.
Thank you, Javier. Thank you, Clara.